Welcome everybody. This is Scope in CSS with and without JavaScript. And if you have, if this is your second session in a row seeing me talk, either thank you or I'm sorry, whatever you'd like to take there. As I'm sure you've seen throughout the day already, there is a posted code of conduct that everybody should be following. Let's treat each other well and abide by the code of conduct. Because the dude abides. When I see abides, I can't help but think of that. I am Brian Perry. I'm a lead front-end developer at a company called Bounteous, and I live in the Chicago suburbs. And I'm a lover of all things component-driven, so building and theming with components in Drupal, pattern library and design system tools like Pattern Lab and Storybook, and then increasingly building with component-based JavaScript frameworks like React. And that starts to kind of cross over a little bit with what we'll be talking about today. Also a lover of all things Nintendo. So love to talk to you about the cool games you're playing on your Switch. Sounds like there's going to be some video games at the party tonight. Pretty excited about that. I'm currently playing Pokemon Sword, Fire Emblem Three Houses as well, and I'm really excited for the new Animal Crossing game. And I am on the internet in a bunch of places and would love to internet with you. And as I mentioned, I work for a company called Bounteous. We have offices throughout North America, but a couple in the Chicago area that I frequent. Drupal is one of a handful of things that we do. But what I focus on there, and I work with a great team of Drupal folks, learn so much from them on a day-to-day basis. We're often hiring, so if you're looking to do great Drupal work, get in touch. And if you're looking to have great Drupal work done, I'm sure I can also get you in touch with somebody. So today, let's talk about CSS. CSS has global scope. So all the rules that you write are in the global namespace and apply globally, which is great if you want that. So if you want to write a small number of rules that apply to a lot of your front-end code, it's not so great when you don't want that. I'll give people a second to catch up to that. Obviously, this is being a little snarky, but I've definitely experienced things like this. I'm sure many in the room who have worked with CSS have experienced something similar, unintended consequences. And a newer approach of writing CSS and JavaScript, many CSS and JavaScript solutions provide an approach to component scope. So CSS scope that will not leak out of the component it's defined in and not affect anything else. And as you might imagine, on the internet, people disagree about these different approaches and fight about it because, you know, the internet. But my personal opinion is that I think we should take advantage of both approaches, and there are some advantages in using them together. So that's my talk. Thanks. Is the room monitor here? How am I doing on time? Is it? All right. I'm looking at my watch. I think I may have undershot it just a little bit. So I guess maybe we could go through it again and just like dig a little deeper. So this is Scope in CSS with and without JavaScript. I'm Brian Perry. CSS has global scope. So let's look a little bit at what that actually means. So this is just a really simple code pen here that we'll take a look at here, focusing on, how did it do that? Inherited properties of CSS. So we'll talk about some of CSS's superpowers. But a simple one is that certain properties can be inherited to children. So we have a couple of lines of text, one that's an H1, one that's a paragraph, and we have a rule here that applies to the HTML element, setting the font family to the one true font of Comic Sans. And that also applies to its children, the H1 and the paragraph. If we didn't have that, then we would have to do something like this and define it for the paragraph. And then that line now applies to the paragraph. And then we'd also have to say, well, it actually also applies to the H1. And we'd have to kind of do that throughout and either have really complicated selectors or a lot of redundant code. So thankfully, inherited properties are one of the great ways that we can write CSS that applies throughout our application. So, kind of continuing down that path, there is also the concept of the cascade, the C in CSS. Style sheets can have a number of different origins, and there are rules that dictate how those rules are combined together. So there's author, user, and system, and how they're combined and ordered is the cascade. And this is a diagram from a CSS Tricks article that kind of goes into how some of these rules all come together to understand CSS styling order. It's very simple and straightforward and always easy to remember. Of course, I'm exaggerating a little bit because this diagram is pretty intense. But it can be complicated, but it also, again, is an advantage of traditional global CSS. So the best way that I've found to describe this is actually the spec. So a little wordy here, but so how the cascade works is that it's going to find all declarations that apply to the element and property for the current media type, and then it's going to sort using those different origins and also importance. So there's user agent declarations, and then user normal declarations, defined by the user. Then author normal declarations, so things that you define in your code. And then you can use important to override them and say this one really has to apply. But then at the end of the day, the user can say, actually, I know you want your font to be this. But for me to be able to interact with your website, I want the font to be bigger. So I win. And then if rules have the same origin and importance, they're sorted with specificity, which we'll talk about in a second. And if all else fails, it's just the order that they're processed. So specificity, like I mentioned, a fun way to talk about specificity that I found online is CSS Specificity Wars, which talks about specificity from the lens of Star Wars. So you have the element selector, that's a stormtrooper, not very specific. Class, attribute, or pseudo-class is a little bit more specific. An ID selector will trump that, so you got Darth Vader there. And then the style attribute, so like an inline style, is even more specific. And then also you have the universal selector, or things that are inherited, essentially have a specificity of 0. And it is more complicated than that. So this article outlines how all those different types of specificity can be combined together to get essentially like a point value. We don't really have time to go all the way into it. But this outlines it really nicely. And it also is a lot to really be able to look at your selectors and understand what specificity is going to win. Unless you just use the Death Star. That'll figure it out pretty quickly for you. But CSS-in-JS approaches can provide component scope and other advantages. So why CSS-in-JS? What are some of the advantages there, writing your CSS inside of JavaScript? So we talked a little bit already about component scope. So that's the idea that the CSS that you define in a component won't leak out. It won't apply to another element on your page. It's also potentially an advantage to be able to co-locate your styles with your components, have it right next to it packaged up all together or in the same file. Can be a positive developer experience. It's also an advantage for components that are packaged and distributed, so things that you want to distribute on NPM, for example, knowing that you're going to have all the stuff you need right there for that component to render. Also, because all of your styles are in JavaScript and you're likely using some sort of bundler to package it up together, there can be some dead code elimination. It will know what CSS rules are or are not going to be used and can strip out the ones that are not going to be used to reduce the size of your bundle. It also potentially helps with the naming a little bit, knowing that your scope is limited to your component. You don't have to be as worried about using class naming to prevent CSS rules from interfering with each other. And then also, this approach allows you to respond to props that are passed in, properties that are passed into the component, and change your styling accordingly. So rather than doing something in like more of a traditional vanilla JavaScript approach or like a jQuery kind of way, where you're changing class names and juggling class names to affect the styling, it can just understand, the component can understand some of its state and change its styles accordingly. And yes, admittedly, there are probably some cases where people pick this approach because they don't know enough about CSS or are somehow afraid of it. But why not? Why wouldn't somebody use this approach? You still have to know CSS to use it, even the hard parts of CSS. It can come with a bundle size or performance cost. Typically, there's some sort of runtime that has to be part of your bundle to facilitate this. There are starting to be some approaches that eliminate that runtime, but it's also a barrier of entry, right? Somebody who is great at writing CSS might not be as comfortable writing JavaScript. And we're adding additional layers to the process here rather than just writing our CSS. There's potentially a runtime, particular API to be able to define your CSS. And also focusing so much on a component, knowing that the styles will not leak, potentially can get people in the habits of writing things that are either inconsistent or just a one-off, where there's the opportunity to reuse things. So, which one of those approaches is the right one? And you're probably not surprised to hear that I say that there are some advantages to both, and I think that using both together can be a great thing. So that's my talk. Hopefully that was long enough. I think, looking at my watch, no, I am still very, very under on time. So I guess maybe we could just go through it again in some more detail. So this is scope in CSS with and without JavaScript. CSS has global scope. So we talked about the Cascade and specificity and inheritance, which is obviously represented by mourners arguing over a house in this image. And some of that stuff is hard, and understanding how those rules come together can be challenging. So we should get our act together to try to balance that out. So enter CSS methodologies as a way to try to deal with that. So these are particular approaches to writing or organizing your CSS. Some popular methodologies are object-oriented CSS. Especially popular in the Drupal community is BEM, which stands for Block Element Modifier. There's also SMACS, which is Scalable and Modular Architecture for CSS. But they have opinions on things like file organization and naming conventions, and it will often give you something that does feel like component scope, more specific rules that apply to a particular component or particular context. But it is not literally component scope. But let's talk about BEM a little bit. BEM is pretty popular in the front-end development community, so many are probably familiar with it. But let's look at a quick example for those who have not used this methodology before. So this is based on a post I found, I think it's called BEM for Everyone Else, that uses an emoji as an example to describe BEM. So I just created a little code pen to illustrate it. So the B in BEM stands for block, and that's kind of the top level container, which in this case is a face. And we have a div that is face, and with that we just get the yellow circle of our emoji. And then the E in BEM is an element. So those are elements inside of the block. You can almost think of them as like sub-components. So we're going to create one for the eyes. And give it a class. And then face. And then the convention is double underscore, and then the element name. All right. So we've got our eyes there in their default state, and then we'll also add a mouth. There we go. All right, so now we have our block of face and our elements of the eyes and mouth in their default state. The M stands for modifier, so you can add an additional class to adjust the styling of either of these elements, for example. So let's say we want our eyes to be open. We keep the default class, but we also add face, double underscore, eyes, and then 2 dashes, and we'll say open for open eyes. And now the emoji's eyes are open, and we'll also open the mouth. So now our mouth is open, very shocked. Yeah, so that's kind of it at a high level. It gives you a nice structure and a convention that your team can follow, nice specific classes related to the pieces of this. There's other ways that things can be combined together when there are complicated components with many elements. You can apply modifiers at even the block level. So if we do face devil here, oh boy, what happened? Oh, I did that wrong. You have to keep the face class and then face devil. So face devil modifier, our emoji is shocked and red. So yeah, those are the kind of basics of BEM, and I think BEM is pretty great. It gives you a nice understandable structure, so it makes it really easy to scaffold out like a component that you're working on. You know the basic structure of your markup, the basic naming conventions for your classes, and can then dive in from there. And it does give you nice, specific component-focused classes that are a little bit less likely to run into conflicts with things like the Cascade. But in practice, it feels like component scope, but it really isn't scoped to the component, so conflicts are still possible. It's not enforced at the tooling level, although there are some exceptions, like with linting, with like SASLint, you can enforce BEM naming conventions at least. But it also requires discipline across your dev team. Everybody needs to be on board with this approach and actually follow it, and follow it in the same way. And naming can still be difficult, even though there is this general guideline. I've still found myself, especially in the case of pretty complicated components where things are nested, it takes some thought to figure out what the right way to name things actually is. And CSS-in-JS can provide component scope. So let's actually look at some examples of that. The first one that we'll look at is using a library called styled components with React. So we'll go to the CSS-in-JS playground here, which is a nice little demo site. If you haven't experimented with any of these CSS-in-JS solutions, it's a great place to do it. They have just this example page, and you can pick from a bunch of libraries and see how they actually work. But we're going to look at the form here. So we're importing React, and then we're importing styled from the styled components library. And then what that lets us do is create these constants here. So we're going to create a button in this case. That is a styled.button. And then it's probably pretty hard to see on the screen from out there, but there are those backticks. And we open up a backtick, which is what JavaScript calls a tag template literal. And then in there we write our CSS code, just like we would typically write CSS. So that'll give us our button styles that we see here. And then I also mentioned the idea of this approach allowing you to take advantage of props that are passed into your component. So the submit button has a simple example of that. Right here it says that if the button is disabled, it's going to use one particular CSS rule for the color. And then if the prop is not disabled, then it'll use a different color. No class name juggling necessary. So if I go here and enter in my email address and what starts to resemble a phone number, we see that as the button's no longer disabled, the styling then just automatically changes. So it's pretty nice. And then these rules are applied to just the component in this case, by default anyway. So if I inspect it and we look at the markup, we'll see that the runtime actually adds in these essentially like gobbledygook class names. And that's what makes it so that the styles won't leak out. Because unless you're doing something crazy, those classes aren't going to be used anywhere else. I think styled components has some control over exactly what naming convention is used here. Other libraries give you something that's a little bit more readable, but still unique. So that's a example with styled components. Let's take a look at an example in Vue rather than React, because Vue also has some interesting approaches to style scoping. So this is just a little code sandbox. And really all that we have here are 3 different H3s that are being rendered on the page. And the first one is just a regular H3, like the H3 element. And then the second one is like an H3 component that can be used. And then the last one is one that has its styles scoped. So let's look at the code for some of these. So we'll look at the global heading component first. And this is using Vue's like single file component approach. So you have your template, your JavaScript, and your CSS all in one file. So yeah, we have just an H3, and we pass in the heading prop into it, and we have our styles down here. And those, by default, in this case, are applied globally. So these styles of it being green and having the black border also apply to the other H3 that's just a regular H3 rendered out on the page. Then we have the scoped heading, and it's basically the same component, but the big difference is that in the style section here, we have the scoped attribute. And if you add the scoped attribute, then it ensures that the styles for this component are just scoped to this one component. So we have a rule for H3 that it's just H3. We're not doing anything else to be more specific, but it only applies to this one H3, or at least this H3 component. And then if we were to remove it, I'm sure you can guess what's going to happen here, given some of the things that we talked about. If this will kick in and wake up, maybe. There we go. So if we remove the scoping from it, due to specificity, as we talked about before, and some of the rule ordering, since this is the last one, it is just going to apply and affect all the other H3s on the page. But I think it's pretty cool that you can control that and specify if you want these styles to apply globally or if you want them to just be within the scope of this component. So based on all that, you probably know what slide is next and what I'm going to say next. You know, why can't we have both of these things when we're writing our CSS? The girl from the, I think it was a taco commercial for hard shell and soft shell tacos, very relevant to lunch. Yeah, why can't we have both of these things? And thanks. That's definitely my talk. I am still really short. Boy, wow, these are long sessions here. All right, let's go through it one more time and dive in a little bit deeper. So this is scope in CSS with and without JavaScript. And CSS has global scope. So we talked about the Cascade and specificity and inheritance, and we talked about methodologies like BEM. But a question that I had and that you might be asking is, like, can regular CSS have something like component scope? So the answer to that, as we've kind of touched on before, is not really. But another trend in the styling world that I think is worth talking about a little bit is the idea of atomic or functional CSS. So this is a very different approach, but does also kind of override some of the things with inheritance and the Cascade in some ways. But what you have here are small single-purpose classes that have a particular function. So their naming tells you what they're going to do. It could be a font size or a margin size or something. And they're immutable. They don't change. They always do one specific thing. And it really takes the control out of CSS and the styling control into your markup. And there are also kind of a couple of sub-approaches within this. One is the static approach. So you basically have a particular set of utility classes that you can use. There's usually some control with variables to customize it a little bit. There's also the kind of wild programmatic approach where you define your functional CSS and your markup, and then that is generated. The CSS is actually generated by what you use in your markup. So Tailwind is a popular framework for this that I hear about more and more. And this GIF from their homepage actually illustrates the approach pretty well. You have your markup, and you type in your utility classes that pretty clearly tell you what's going to happen. Text purple 500, for example, and the styles change accordingly. And you're not going in and creating a rule for text purple 500. It's part of the library, and you use it as you see fit. Personally, for me, this is not really something that's all that attractive. It takes away a lot of the workflow that I'm used to for CSS and kind of what I like about controlling CSS. But it's something that I hear about more and more, and I've definitely heard people who it's really fit their workflow well and really like it. But also, I just think that it's interesting that this kind of falls into the category of another potentially unexpected approach where people are trying to do something that gives them styling control, but also fights back about some of the global things that CSS does by default. And, as we've mentioned a number of times, CSS-in-JS can provide component scope. But the flip side to that is, could CSS-in-JS be more like regular CSS in that it could be global? And so CSS modules is another approach in this CSS-in-JS arena that gets at that a little bit. So for those who aren't familiar with CSS modules, it's a little bit different from something like styled components that we looked at in that it's not a package. It's something that's typically handled by a build process, a bundler like Webpack. And it scopes styles locally by default, anyway. It can also play nicely with Sass, or in this case, Webpack Sass Loader. It ships with Create React app now, and also Gatsby. Gatsby was the first way that I was introduced to this and got a chance to play around with it. And it also has this super snarky logo where modules overflows its container. So to talk about this, we're just going to look at a simple example from a little side project, a static site about static sites that I built a little while back. And these card components. So nothing all that complicated here. Some headings, some body copy, styled in a particular way. So this is a Sass partial for that component, project_card.module.scss. The actual styles themselves aren't super important. The general structure probably is what's important here. So we have the kind of top-level element, the project card, the block in BEM there, and then some elements inside, title, language, description, and you'll note that these are all pretty generic class names, like title is a pretty generic class, but because this is going to be scoped locally, it's not going to cause any conflicts. And then in our component, our project_card.js, we import styles from the partial that we were looking at. It's the .module part of the extension. In this case, this was with Gatsby. It tells Gatsby that this should be handled as a CSS module. But if we import it in that way, we're going to get a styles object that we can use in our JSX in the render method here. So, for example, we can say styles.projectCard, and that's essentially going to give it... Oh, no! How did my laser pointer do that? Well, we can still see, I guess. That is weird. All right. Anyway, so we can say styles.projectcard, styles.language, so we're passing that into the class name prop. So that's going to apply those styles. And then if I wonder if I do it again, does it come back down? Okay. But yeah, so if we actually inspect the component and take a look, similar to what we saw before, we'll see that in our component, we see the kind of classes there with the module and the component name, and then some sort of unique string to make this less likely to conflict, all applied there. So just in the context of this component. And these are scoped to the component. Here's our friend here asking why don't we have both. Jumping the gun a little bit because CSS modules actually handles this pretty well. So you can also have global CSS. So this is the same component, but with a global approach. So the Sass partial here doesn't have the .modules extension, so it's just going to be treated as a regular Sass partial. And then we can, for the class name prop, we can just pass the string of project card and language and title. So those classes are going to be applied, and those styles are imported globally, so they'll just apply everywhere. So that potentially has some advantages, being able to do both of those things together, have globally scoped CSS where you want it, and component scope CSS where you want it. And a current project that I'm working on, still ongoing, so talking about it pretty generally here, is a progressively decoupled site. So we actually found ourselves in a situation where an approach like this could help. So we're dealing with multiple templating engines in this case, but we do have shared styles that each of them needed to use. So on the Drupal side, it's using Twig in Drupal 8, has some of its own unique styles and components. And then in React, it's using JSX, and it also has some of its own unique styles and components. But with the site as a whole, there are definitely a number of global styles that we want to apply in both cases. So things like typography, spacing scale, things like that. We did find, and this was a question as we started the project, that there weren't really many truly shared components in both places. So it's really just the shared CSS that we were trying to find an efficient way to use here. And after considering some other things, we did land on using this CSS modules approach, at the very least on the React side. But what this let us do is have Sass partials that both of the portions of the stack could share and use as they see fit. So on the React side, it's using CSS modules through Webpack, and the styles are being imported in JavaScript, but using a mix of global and component scope. So sometimes things are imported globally, and other things are imported at the component level. And there also was some CSS that's specific to this project. And then on the Drupal side, we have a little bit of a more traditional Sass build that's generating just a large CSS file, but we're specifying the partials that we want to use in the Drupal site. So being able to have both and being able to share in that way, we found works pretty well. So you can have both. You can have the peanut butter in your chocolate. And so as we talk about CSS-in-JS and scope and all that stuff, many people might think about the separation of concerns. And I was certainly taught a particular view on separation of concerns between CSS and JavaScript and HTML, that they are separate things that live in their own little space. And they work together, but they are separate concerns. And this isn't an image that I created. Many of you may have seen it before. But with this component-based approach that's common in a lot of the JavaScript frameworks, it's really just a different view of the separation of concerns, where it's at the component level. And you want your button and your modal to have all of the things that it needs to be able to render, your JavaScript, CSS, and HTML. And maybe those things are in the same file, maybe they're not, but you at least know that they're all there available for that component. So just a different view, and I think to some extent both are valid. So in this list of questions here, could we have component scope, but with less JavaScript? All the cases that we looked at use JavaScript in some way. So thinking about this, I thought about the idea of kind of popular extensions finding their way into a language natively. So in CSS, that's been happening recently. There are things that have been popularized in Sass that are finding their way into CSS more generally. So CSS custom properties has some of the functionality of like Sass variables, but also some additional superpowers. Nesting is a thing that is finding its way into CSS as well. Even in the Drupal world, and I know I've only really said Drupal a few times, but I made it, check. There's recent examples like JSON API being a contrib project that found its way into core, or Layout Builder being inspired by the panels ecosystem. But really the best example, I think, of this is actually JavaScript itself, in that the language continues to evolve with things like ES6 and ES Next and ES whatever version it is now, where there are bundlers and transpilers like Babel. And what Babel does is you can write using modern JavaScript, and then it transpiles that down into JavaScript that can be supported more broadly across browsers. So you write with the new hotness, but still get something that can be used more broadly. And then what's happening over time is that more and more of those things that you used to have to use Babel to transpile for you are becoming part of JavaScript more broadly and part of like vanilla JavaScript, and are being globally supported by the browser. So over time, that stuff is kind of finding its way and flowing back down into JavaScript. So, could something like this happen for scope with CSS? And interestingly enough, it very briefly, for a tiny blip of time, did. There was a scoped attribute for HTML, which has that one little green blip for Firefox for a specific period of time. Never really caught on. But essentially, it was the same thing that we looked at with Vue, where you could say the scoped attribute to control your scoped CSS. So who knows? Maybe some other variation on this will find its way back in, or maybe not. But I think it is pretty interesting that even though this never really took off, people have found ways to do it with other tools. Another potential option here is that web components might be the way that we get some of this control. So web components and the shadow DOM, they scope styles locally by default, as I understand it. And there also are some ways to override styles or use global styles as well. But it also does still, and I'm far from an expert in web components. It's definitely something I want to try to spend some more time brushing up on, but still requires writing a decent amount of JavaScript to do that. So maybe it's still the more native version of things, but you might find that you still have to write JavaScript to give yourself that control. And of course, I don't know where this is going to end up, but even with the tools that we have today, especially working on decoupled applications, I think there are some advantages to being able to have this control over scope and use both together. There seems to be an ongoing interest in finding ways to do this and tools that can do it and do it better and more efficiently. So I'd like to think that there is a future where having this level of control over scope in CSS is actually a thing, but only Yoda really knows. So that is pretty much it. I'll remind everybody about the contribution day tomorrow. I will be there doing some work and hanging out until I have to head out to the airport. So love to chat with folks more about this sort of stuff, or just say hi. And that really finally is actually the end of my talk. So thanks. And I have time for questions if anybody has questions. Or if you want more tacos, there's probably more tacos. Yes. And thank you.
So how much of this are you doing presently? Any projects that you're working on?
Yeah. So the current project that I am on right now was the one that slide with the React and Drupal was based on. So that has shared CSS partials that both React portion of the application and Drupal are using. So that is the first one where we've used like specifically that approach. And then for React projects that I've done, which for me has been a little bit more in like the learning and side projects kind of area, I tend to use CSS-in-JS. I mostly use CSS-in-JS. I found that now I default to using CSS modules. It's just the best developer experience from my perspective. I can still write like regular CSS, but I get all the benefits of CSS-in-JS. Yes?
So is that the typical use case when you're doing decoupled? So, I mean, if you're just doing a standard Drupal environment?
Yeah, if you're just doing a standard Drupal environment and are not using JavaScript, CSS in JavaScript is not for you. Yep, but I do think it's interesting, to me anyway, just that general concept of scope, and if there would at some point in the future be a way to do that in your regular CSS. I find that interesting. But yeah, if you're not using JavaScript, you're not using CSS and JS. It's processing there.
Well, yeah. I mean, because, I mean, don't you do selectors to define specificity on your CS regularly? I mean,
yeah, you do. You definitely do. But it takes effort to do that. You need to know how to do it. And even someone like yourself who's probably experienced in it, I'm sure there are still times where you don't get it exactly right. You know?
What?
Yeah. Sorry to accuse you of something terrible like that. Cool. Anything else?
So do you think, from a team perspective, what's the tension between having a standard set of tools for the team versus a tool for a project that fits the project best?
Yeah, and I neglected to repeat the other questions, but this one was from team perspective. Thoughts on like having a particular tool that fits the team best or the project best. Yeah, that's a little difficult to answer. My personal opinion is that I tend to favor the particular team and the particular team makeup. So if, like, a Drupal example is that doing Drupal front-end work, I like to take a component approach, and I like using a tool like Pattern Lab to use a pattern library. But even though that's my preference, in cases where there are maybe like a small-scale project, maybe the additional effort for that tooling isn't worth it. Or if you do have a team that's just not familiar with that, maybe your team can be most efficient with a different approach. So I guess my general answer would be trying to find like a default state that your team or your company or agency uses by default, and then you can change from it when necessary. But then the other thing that's interesting is, like at my company, we have a Drupal practice and a React practice, and I think it's fine for those two different sections of the company to have a different perspective on this that works for them, as long as we know that there's a way that they can work together. You're welcome. Cool. Anything else? All right, thanks everybody.